My name is Lucy. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions are made quietly, behind glass walls, with whiteboards full of numbers that look neutral but never really are. I've been called dependable, calm, low maintenance, the kind of person people trust with responsibility, but not always with credit. If you met me briefly, you might think I'm careful, maybe even a little reserved. I don't speak first in meetings unless I need to. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence loudly. And because of that, people often assume they understand my limits very quickly. They mistake stillness for softness. They mistake consistency for compliance. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning in the way we usually imagine it. There are no raised voices, no dramatic exits, no public humiliation. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely, and for a long time it looked like nothing was happening at all. I'm telling it now because I think many of us have lived some version of it, especially women who learned early that being easy to work with often comes at a cost. We're taught that patience will be rewarded, that effort speaks for itself, that fairness is built into the system if we just keep our heads down and do good work. This is the story of what happens when those assumptions collide with reality. Over the course of this narrative, you'll hear about small moments that felt insignificant at the time, emails that were phrased just carefully enough, meetings where decisions were already made before anyone sat down, compliments that sounded like praise but functioned like boundaries. You'll also hear about silence, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from watching, listening, documenting, learning how power actually moves when no one is announcing it out loud. I won't exaggerate what I felt. There was anger, yes, but it wasn't explosive. Mostly there was clarity, a slow, uncomfortable understanding of how I was being positioned and how easy it would be to stay there if I did nothing. This story is honest. That means admitting where I waited too long, where I rationalized things I shouldn't have, where being professional became a way to avoid asking harder questions. It also means being honest about what worked, not because it was clever or dramatic, but because it was quiet and precise. If you're looking for catharsis, this may feel restrained. If you're looking for a blueprint for how to destroy someone, this isn't that. What it is, instead, is a record of how psychological balance can shift without anyone raising their voice. By the end, nothing explodes, but nothing is the same either. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, not to answer out loud, just to hold in mind as you listen. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that being underestimated was never an accident? To them, I was steady. That was the word I heard most often, usually said with a small nod, as if it explained everything. Lucy's steady. As if steadiness were a personality rather than a baseline expectation. As if it were something you could lean on without ever looking too closely at what was carrying the weight. In meetings, I was the one people glanced at when a question about process came up, not strategy, process. I knew where things lived, who had approved what, which version of the document was final. I was looped in early, trusted to keep things moving. When deadlines were tight, my name appeared quietly on calendar invites that didn't include titles or explanations, just an assumption that I'd understand. And I did. I understood that I wasn't there to dominate the room. I wasn't there to be inspirational. I was there to make sure nothing fell apart. When new hires joined, I was often asked to show them the ropes. Not officially, just a Slack message, friendly, informal. I was good at it. I didn't overwhelm people. I answered questions fully without making anyone feel small. Managers noticed this and thanked me for being such a team player. That phrase followed me everywhere. Team player meant I didn't need credit spelled out. Team player meant I'd be fine if my name wasn't on the slide. Team player meant I'd pick up what others dropped without making it awkward. I didn't push back. Not because I didn't notice, but because pushing back always seemed unnecessary, at least at first. There was a kind of invisibility that came with being competent and calm. When things went right, it was because we had a great team. When things went wrong, I was often asked, gently, what could have been done differently, as if the responsibility for foresight naturally belonged to me. No one was unkind. That's important to say. There were no villains, no overt dismissals, just patterns, habits, a quiet sorting of who was expected to speak and who was expected to support. In larger meetings, I noticed how eye contact moved. When I spoke, people listened, but they rarely built on what I said. The conversation would pause, absorb my point, then continue as if it had emerged collectively rather than from me. Sometimes, a few minutes later, someone else would repeat the same idea with slightly different phrasing, and that version would stick. I told myself this was normal, that it wasn't personal, that influence worked in subtle ways. I dressed neutrally, nothing that demanded attention. My voice stayed even. I didn't use qualifiers, but I also didn't insist. I had learned, long before this job, that being agreeable made things smoother, and smoothness was often rewarded. Performance reviews reflected this perception perfectly. Reliable, consistent, low drama, always delivers. There was praise, but it sat low on the page like a foundation you don't decorate. No one wrote about vision, no one wrote about leadership potential. I was described as someone who made other people's ideas executable. I noticed that when stretch opportunities came up, projects that were visible, risky, career-defining, they were usually framed as burdens. This one's going to be intense. A lot of pressure. And then assigned elsewhere, often to people who spoke more, even if they executed less. I didn't resent them. That surprised me, looking back. I didn't feel anger so much as a dull sense of misalignment, like wearing a shoe that fits well enough not to complain, but never quite right. To them, I was dependable background infrastructure. The person you assume will be there, working, regardless of recognition. The person whose silence feels comfortable, reassuring. What they never asked, what never came up, was whether I wanted something different. Whether I had ambitions that extended beyond keeping the machine running. And I didn't volunteer that information. Because at that stage, I still believed that if I stayed precise, stayed fair, stayed professional long enough, the system would eventually notice. That being seen was just a matter of time. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what made it dangerous. It came in the form of an email. Brief, polite, almost thoughtful. A recap after a client call I had led the day before. I had spent weeks preparing for that conversation, anticipating objections, mapping out scenarios, aligning internal stakeholders so nothing would unravel mid-call. The meeting itself went smoothly. The client asked difficult questions. I answered them. By the end, there was a clear next step and an unspoken sense that trust had been established. The email went out the next morning. It summarized the call accurately. That was the strange part. The points were all there, the concerns I had addressed, the direction we agreed on, but my name wasn't. The sender thanked everyone who contributed and highlighted how the team had handled the conversation well. There was a specific call out for one colleague, someone who had joined the meeting late and spoken briefly at the end. His comment was fine, not pivotal, but it was visible. I reread the email twice, then a third time, looking for something I might have missed. A forwarded message, a follow-up thread where context was added. Nothing. It was small, almost petty to notice, so I didn't say anything. I told myself the recap wasn't about credit, that the important thing was momentum, that leadership could see the calendar invites, the prep documents, and the meeting notes. Surely they knew who had done the work. Still, something shifted. Not loudly, just enough to register. A few days later, the same pattern repeated. Another meeting, another recap, another vague reference to support without attribution. This time, a different name appeared. Again, someone adjacent, not central. I felt a flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed. Irritation felt unprofessional. I reminded myself that I didn't need external validation, that my work spoke for itself. But work, I was learning, speaks softly unless someone amplifies it. The first real cut came during a weekly pipeline review. I was presenting an update on a deal I had originated months earlier. I walked through the progress, the obstacles, and the strategy. Halfway through, my manager interrupted, not unkindly, to reframe what I had just said. He repeated my points, almost verbatim, but with a layer of authority added by tone alone. The room nodded along. Someone asked him a follow-up question. He answered. I stayed quiet. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and thanked me for being flexible and letting the conversation flow. He said it like it was a strength, like restraint was a virtue in itself. That was when I felt it clearly, a thin line being drawn. On one side were people expected to shape narratives. On the other were people were expected to support them without friction. I was being placed, gently, politely, on the second side. No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. A colleague joked later about how meetings were all politics anyway. Another told me I was lucky not to be in the spotlight. Less pressure, she said. You're smart to stay under the radar. I smiled and agreed. But that night, I opened my notebook, the black leather one I carried everywhere, and wrote down the date. The meeting, the interruption, the email. No commentary, just facts. I didn't know why I did it. It wasn't a plan, it was instinct, a quiet refusal to let the moment dissolve completely. Because even then, I understood something important. The first cut is never meant to hurt. It's meant to test whether you'll notice. And whether you'll decide that noticing isn't worth the trouble. Once the first cut didn't bleed, it became easier to ignore the next ones. They arrived quietly, spaced far enough apart to feel coincidental. A comment here, an omission there. Nothing you could point to and say, this is wrong, without sounding overly sensitive. That's how normalization works. Not by force, but by repetition. I started noticing how often decisions about my work were discussed without me in the room. I would hear about them later, secondhand, usually framed as updates rather than changes. Someone would say, we tweaked the approach slightly, and only later would I realize that the tweak was a fundamental shift, one I would now be responsible for executing. When I asked questions, they were answered kindly, but briefly, as if curiosity itself were slightly inconvenient. I adapted. I told myself that seniority looked like detachment, that influence didn't require presence, that being looped in on everything was inefficient. I rationalized my exclusion as trust. They wouldn't make these calls if they didn't know I could handle the outcome. That logic felt comforting. It allowed me to stay calm, to remain professional, to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. I leaned into it because it preserved my self-image as someone above office politics. But something else was happening underneath. My role was slowly narrowing. I was asked less often for my opinion at the beginning of projects and more often for my help at the end. I became the person who sanity checked decisions after they were already made. The person who fixed misalignments quietly without reopening discussions. There's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from being consulted too late. You can see the flaws clearly, but pointing them out feels disruptive. So you correct what you can and absorb the rest. I absorbed a lot. I noticed how praise was distributed. Loud contributions were celebrated immediately. Subtle ones were acknowledged later, if at all, often in private. I was thanked one-on-one for things others were applauded for publicly. At first, I appreciated the discretion. Public praise can feel performative. Private gratitude felt more sincere. But over time, I saw the trade-off. What's praised publicly becomes part of the story. What's handled privately disappears. I started to feel like a ghost in my own work, present everywhere, visible nowhere. Still, I didn't speak up. Part of me believed that patience was a strategy, that endurance was a kind of leverage. I had seen people burn bridges by insisting on recognition too early. I didn't want to be labeled difficult. I didn't want to shift how people perceived me. So when my contributions were summarized by others, I let it happen. When my ideas were reframed and represented, I told myself that alignment mattered more than ownership. When I was described as support instead of lead, I smiled and corrected nothing. Each time it cost me something small, not enough to demand action, just enough to accumulate. I also noticed a change in how I spoke. I became more careful, more concise. I stopped elaborating unless asked. I avoided pushing back in group settings, saving my concerns for private conversations that felt safer. Those conversations rarely changed anything. People would listen, nod, agree that I had a point, and then proceed as planned. My input became something to acknowledge, not integrate. And slowly, without anyone stating it outright, my silence became expected. If I didn't speak, no one invited me to. If I didn't object, no one assumed there was an objection. If I absorbed the impact, the system stayed comfortable. I told myself this was temporary, that I was building credibility, that eventually my restraint would be recognized as maturity. But deep down, something was hardening. Not anger, awareness. I began to understand that disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, sustained by your willingness to be reasonable. And once it's normalized, reversing it requires more than speaking up. It requires changing the terms entirely. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like a label you don't see until it's already been attached. I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being used correctly, according to a role that benefited everyone but me. I saw it clearly during a planning session for a major initiative, the kind that determines budgets, visibility, and who gets invited into the next tier of decision-making. I had been involved since the earliest stages, researching, modeling scenarios, identifying risks. By the time the session happened, much of the groundwork was already done. Not by magic, by me. As the meeting began, roles were assigned with casual efficiency. One person would own client communication, another would drive strategy. A third would be the executive-facing lead. When it came to me, the language shifted. Lucy will support. Lucy can help keep things on track. Lucy's great at details. No one asked if I wanted to lead anything. No one framed my involvement as directional. I was infrastructure, necessary, replaceable in theory, but inconvenient to lose in practice. And I let it happen. Because pushing back would have required naming the pattern out loud. It would have required asking for something directly, in a room where indirectness was the unspoken rule. I told myself that leadership didn't need titles, that influence could exist without formal authority. But that belief started to feel thin. The more reliable I was, the more invisible the role became. I was the person people depended on to smooth tensions, clarify confusion, and quietly fix what others missed. I was trusted with complexity, but not with power. That distinction mattered. I noticed how expectations formed around me. If I raised a concern, it was framed as helpful caution. If someone else raised the same concern, it was framed as a strategic insight. If I stayed late to finish something, it was assumed. If I didn't, it was noticed. I had become predictable in a way that worked against me. There's a comfort people find in someone who doesn't disrupt their self-image. I made it easy for others to feel competent, decisive, and in control. My presence didn't threaten their authority, it reinforced it. And that was the role. The quiet stabilizer, the one who makes others look good, the one who absorbs risk without accruing visibility. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I began to recognize how language shaped expectation. Words like help, support, and assist followed me everywhere. Not because I lacked capability, but because I had never refused them. The role wasn't assigned in a single moment. It was built through a series of yeses. Yes, I'll handle that. Yes, I can stay late. Yes, I don't mind if my name isn't on it. Each yes felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a boundary around my professional identity. I wasn't angry at anyone in particular. That surprised me. I felt something closer to disappointment with myself. I had believed that being indispensable would translate into being valued. Instead, it had made me controllable. I started to understand that organizations don't correct imbalances on their own. They optimize around them. If a system benefits from your silence, it will interpret that silence as consent. The role I was assigned was safe, stable, and ultimately limiting. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What would happen if I stopped performing it? The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no confrontation, no sudden clarity delivered in a dramatic moment. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blends into every other one until you look back and realize it changed everything. I was sitting alone in a small conference room reviewing a draft proposal for a deal that had been moving quietly for months. It was complex, high stakes, the kind of opportunity that reshapes a quarter if it closes. I had been involved since the earliest conversations, mapping the client's internal politics, identifying where procurement would push back, anticipating which concessions would cost us leverage later. By that point, the deal felt familiar, almost intimate. I knew its weak points. I knew where it could break. I was reading through the numbers when I noticed a subtle change in language. Not in the financials themselves, but in how the contribution was framed. Ownership had shifted. The narrative had been adjusted to emphasize cross-functional collaboration with no clear lead identified. It wasn't incorrect. It was incomplete. Normally, I would have noted it, adjusted the language, and sent a polite comment back. But this time, I didn't. I sat there longer than necessary, staring at the screen, feeling something settle. I realized that if this deal closed, and there was a strong chance it would, the story of how it came together was already being written without me. And more than that, I realized I had allowed that to happen. Not because I was powerless, but because I had believed that restraint was a virtue that would eventually be rewarded. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced that I hadn't fully articulated before. Nothing changes unless I change how I participate. It wasn't anger that drove it. It was exhaustion. The fatigue of carrying responsibility without authority, of being central to outcomes but peripheral to recognition. I thought about the notebook in my bag, the dates, the facts, the patterns I had been recording without knowing why. I thought about how often I had chosen ease over accuracy, harmony over truth. And I understood something uncomfortable. My silence had not been neutral. It had been productive for everyone else. That realization didn't make me feel ashamed. It made me feel calm. Because clarity has a way of simplifying things. I didn't decide to confront anyone that day. I didn't rehearse a speech or imagine how it would feel to finally be seen. Instead, I made a smaller, quieter decision. I decided to stop assuming fairness was automatic. I reopened the proposal and read it again, this time not as a contributor, but as an observer. I noted where credit was implied, where responsibility was diffuse, where accountability could later be reassigned if things went wrong. I saved a copy, then another. Then I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. Pay attention to how outcomes are framed. That was it. No drama, no resolve to burn bridges, just a shift in posture from participant to analyst. Over the following days, I noticed how different everything looked once I stopped filling in the gaps with generosity. Conversations I had once brushed off as harmless now carried subtext. Decisions I had accepted as practical now revealed incentives. I didn't become colder, I became more precise. I spoke less but listened more carefully. I stopped volunteering fixes before being asked. I let small inefficiencies surface instead of smoothing them over automatically. People didn't react. That was the interesting part. The system didn't push back when I withdrew my quiet labor. It simply recalibrated around the absence, slowly, imperfectly. And in that recalibration, I saw something else clearly. They didn't underestimate me because I was quiet. They underestimated me because I had taught them that my quietness was free. That day didn't end with a decision to act. It ended with a decision to observe, without self-deception. And that, I would later understand, was the most important shift of all. Silence feels different when it's no longer automatic. Before, my quietness had been reflexive. an instinct shaped by years of learning when to step back, when to smooth things over, when not to make myself inconvenient. It was the kind of silence that comes from anticipation, from preemptively managing other people's comfort. Now it has become deliberate. I didn't announce the change. I didn't frame it as a boundary or a strategy. I simply stopped offering what had never been explicitly asked for. I answered questions fully, but I stopped filling the air with context that no one requested. I attended meetings, but I no longer translated confusion into clarity unless it was my responsibility to do so. At first, nothing happened. People continued as usual, assuming I was tracking everything the way I always had. Tasks still landed near my desk, phrased casually as if proximity alone implied consent. I responded politely but with precision. "Can you take a look at this?" "Yes. What specifically would you like feedback on?" That single question changed the rhythm. It required definition, ownership, intent. And when those things weren't clear, the request often dissolved on its own. I noticed how often my silence created space others weren't prepared to fill. In meetings, pauses stretched longer. Decisions took more time. People looked around, waiting for the familiar sense of alignment to settle the room. It didn't. They mistook my quiet for disengagement at first. I could see it in the way questions were redirected, in the slight tilt of concern during one-on-ones. My manager asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because it was. What I didn't say was that I was no longer compensating for ambiguity. There's a discomfort that surfaces when systems rely on unspoken labor and that labor withdraws. It doesn't explode. It hums. Small inefficiencies accumulate. People start noticing friction where there used to be flow. Still, no one addressed it directly, because addressing it would have meant acknowledging how much of that flow had come from me. I watched carefully. I watched who stepped in when I didn't, who felt entitled to redirect conversations, who grew irritated when outcomes weren't as clean. I noticed who assumed I was still handling it, even when no one had asked me to. Silence, I learned, is often interpreted in whatever way benefits the listener most. Some saw it as an agreement. Some saw it as a weakness. Some saw it as permission. I let them, because correcting those assumptions too early would have given away the shift. I wasn't interested in making a point. I was interested in understanding the structure. I continued documenting dates, requests, language used, how credit was framed, how responsibility moved when things succeeded and when they stalled. Boom. I also noticed something else. My energy changed. Without the constant pressure to preempt problems, I felt clearer, less resentful. I wasn't bracing myself for the next omission. I wasn't rehearsing how to respond to being overlooked. I was simply present. That presence gave me leverage I hadn't had before. When I did speak, it landed differently. Because it was rarer. Because it was contained. Because it didn't arrive wrapped in apology or explanation. People started asking me quietly what I thought, after meetings, inside conversations. Not because I demanded space, but because my absence from the center had become noticeable. I didn't rush to fill it. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I used. And in that space, I could see the system more clearly than ever. Who benefited, who coasted, who assumed stability without maintaining it. They still thought my quiet meant compliance. They had no idea it meant preparation. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. They assumed my quiet meant disengagement, or at best, patience. They didn't realize that without the constant drain of fixing, translating, and smoothing, I had space to observe the system with unusual clarity. I wasn't just watching people, I was watching patterns. I began with documentation, not because I planned to use it against anyone, but because clarity requires evidence. I saved emails, I archived calendar invites. I noted how often ownership language shifted depending on who was speaking. I tracked how deliverables were framed before and after meetings, and who was positioned as responsible when timelines slipped. It wasn't obsessive, it was methodical. I noticed, for example, that when deals were discussed early, the contribution was vague. Everyone was aligned. Everyone was involved. But as the deal matured, language hardened. Someone became the point person. Someone else became the driver. The timing of that shift was never accidental. I also noticed who controlled narratives. Not the loudest voices, but the ones who sent the recap emails. The ones who summarized outcomes in writing after the room had emptied. Those messages shaped memory. They decided what became official. So I started paying attention to timing. Who followed up first? Who framed the next step? Who used we versus I and when? I learned more about the organization in those weeks than I had in years of active participation. I also began revisiting contracts, old ones, active ones. I had always been comfortable with fine print, but now I read with a different lens. Not what does this say, but who does this protect? Some clauses were standard, others were flexible, language that could be interpreted differently depending on context, incentive structures that assumed good faith but didn't enforce it, definitions that mattered only when someone chose to question them. I didn't change anything, I just noted it. I also paid attention to myself. I noticed how often I had previously filled silences to make others comfortable, how frequently I had framed my contributions as support rather than leadership, how I had edited myself before anyone else needed to. That awareness was uncomfortable, but useful, because preparation isn't just external, it's internal alignment. I stopped narrating my work in real time. I stopped preemptively explaining decisions. I let outcomes speak where they could and where they couldn't. I let ambiguity sit unresolved. People began to feel that absence. I could tell by the questions. Are you still across this? Do you have thoughts on where this is headed? Can you weigh in before we finalize? I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't overextend. I didn't volunteer more than was requested. They thought I was conserving energy. In a way I was, but not in the way they imagined. Behind the scenes, I was building a map, not of people's intentions, but of incentives, of what happened when certain individuals were absent, of how value was assigned, reclaimed, or quietly redirected. I also noticed how often my name appeared in documentation when things went wrong, not explicitly blamed, but subtly associated. Lucy was looped in. Lucy reviewed this. Lucy supported the process. Support, I learned, is a double-edged word. It implies involvement without ownership, responsibility without authority. I marked those instances carefully. What they never noticed was that I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering truth. The truth about how much of the system's stability relied on uncredited labor. Truth about how easily narratives could shift with a single line of text. The truth about how rules were interpreted differently depending on who benefited. And perhaps most importantly, the truth about myself. I realized that my strength had never been endurance. It had been a perception, the ability to see what others overlooked because they were too busy performing. That realization changed how I moved. I didn't rush, I didn't hint, I didn't seek validation. I prepared quietly. Because when you understand a system deeply enough, you don't need to announce what you're doing. You only need to know when the moment arrives. And they never noticed that I was getting ready for one. The private reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. When it arrived, it felt almost quiet, like finally reading a sentence you'd been skimming past for years and realizing it had always been there. I was reviewing compensation documentation late one evening, not because I suspected anything in particular, but because I had learned that clarity often lives in places no one expects you to look unless you give them a reason to worry. The deal, the one that had been unfolding in the background for months, was nearing closure. It was, by every measurable standard, the largest opportunity of the quarter. High revenue, high visibility, the kind of win leadership loved to point to in quarterly meetings. I had originated it. That wasn't up for debate. The first outreach, the early discovery calls, the internal alignment, the long stretch of silence was where trust was built slowly and deliberately. My name appeared on all of it, if you knew where to look. What caught my attention wasn't the deal structure. It was a line in the incentive policy tied to it, one I had read before but never needed to interrogate closely. In the event of multi-party contribution, commissions may be reclassified at management discretion. At first glance, it sounded reasonable. Fair, even. Collaboration deserved recognition, but discretion is a quiet word. It leaves space. I followed the cross-reference, then another. I compared it against previous payouts, against similar deals, against how multi-party had been defined historically. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. When a deal needed to be celebrated, ownership was emphasized. When a payout needed to be reduced, the contribution was emphasized. I felt something settle, not anger, not panic, understanding. I pulled past examples, deals smaller than mine that had been treated differently, deals larger than had been handled carefully because the owner was visible, vocal, and protected. I wasn't. My role, quiet, supportive, unassuming, had placed me in a category that was flexible, adjustable, easy to reinterpret after the fact. The realization was simple and devastating. If nothing changed, the story of this deal would be rewritten at the moment it mattered most. I sat back and closed my laptop. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send an email. I didn't even open my notebook. Because this wasn't a moment for documentation, it was a moment for a decision. I understood now what my leverage was and what it wasn't. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't performative. It wasn't based on confrontation. It was structural. I had evidence, timelines, written records, clear origination points. I had followed the process precisely, which meant I had put myself into a position of quiet strength. And I also understood the risk. Using that leverage would change how I was seen forever. It would end the version of me that made others comfortable. There would be no returning to invisibility once I asserted authorship. The private reveal wasn't about discovering injustice. I had suspected that for a while. It was about realizing that fairness was conditional, and that I finally knew the conditions. I went home that night and slept well, better than I had in weeks. Because clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, removes uncertainty. And uncertainty had been the heaviest weight of all. The next morning, I didn't change my behavior. I didn't hint at what I knew. I didn't act guarded. I let the system continue exactly as it was. Because once you see the leverage clearly, you don't rush to use it. You wait until it matters. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like standing on a cliff. It felt like standing in a hallway with 3 open doors, each leading to a different version of my life. I laid them out carefully. No theatrics, no catastrophizing. The first option was to do nothing. Let the deal close. Accept whatever version of the payout arrived. Tell myself that stability mattered more than principle. That raising concerns would make me look petty. That maybe, this time, discretion would lean in my favor. I knew this option well. I had lived inside it for years. It offered short-term peace and long-term erosion. I could already feel how it would end. Not with a single loss, but with a quiet confirmation that this was all I could expect. The second option was to speak up early, to flag the ambiguity in advance, to ask for clarity around ownership before the numbers were final, to frame it as alignment, not accusation. Professional, polite, reasonable. This option appealed to the version of me that still wanted the system to correct itself when presented with facts, but I understood the risk. Raising the issue before the deal closed would invite negotiation, not around fairness, but around compromise. I would be encouraged to be flexible, to consider the bigger picture, to share credit in the name of harmony. And once you accept a diluted version of authorship, you rarely get it back. The third option was irreversible. It required patience, restraint, timing. It meant letting the process complete, allowing the narrative to settle as others expected it to. It meant waiting until the moment when outcomes were concrete, when numbers were no longer hypothetical, when reinterpretation would be obvious rather than theoretical. This option carried risk, too. It would be read as confrontation, even if I remained calm. It would end any illusion that I was content to remain in the background. It would change how leadership interacts with me going forward. But it was the only option that respected the truth of what had happened. I didn't make the decision in one sitting. I lived with it for days. I paid attention to my body when I imagined each path. The first made me feel smaller. The second made me feel tired. The third made me feel steady. That surprised me. I wasn't choosing escalation. I was choosing accuracy. I reviewed my documentation one more time, not to reassure myself, but to ensure I wasn't rewriting history in my favor. I asked myself hard questions. Had I truly originated the deal? Had others contributed meaningfully? Was my claim defensible without emotion? The answers were clear. This wasn't about ego. It was about authorship. I also thought about precedent. Not just for me, but for the version of myself I would have to live with afterward. What standard would I be setting for how my work could be reframed in the future? Silence now would teach the system something, so would clarity. By the end of the week, the decision no longer felt heavy. It felt settled. I chose the irreversible option, not because I wanted conflict, but because I was done participating in ambiguity that only flowed one way. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't rehearse reactions. I didn't warn anyone. I simply made sure that when the moment came, I would speak once, and only once, with precision. Because when you wait long enough, the decision stops being about fear. It becomes about alignment. Once the decision was made, everything became very quiet. Not externally, meetings continued, emails flowed, calendars stayed full, but internally, something had locked into place. I wasn't weighing possibilities anymore. I was executing a sequence. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't change my tone. I didn't correct language in meetings or insert myself into narratives that were already forming without me. I let the momentum carry on exactly as it was. That was the point. I focused on precision. First, I organized my documentation, not dramatically, not like someone preparing for a fight, more like an archivist. Clean timelines, clear chains of communication, origination emails, internal approvals, early drafts with metadata intact, meeting notes with dates and participants. Nothing annotated, nothing editorialized. Facts don't need adjectives. Then I reviewed the policy again. Slowly, carefully. I noted where discretion was mentioned and where it wasn't, where definitions were flexible, where they were explicit. I highlighted nothing. I printed nothing. I wanted to know the terrain well enough that I wouldn't need to reference it in the moment. I also made a small but deliberate change in how I handled conversations. When people spoke about the deal, I listened. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't reinforce them either. If someone said, "This really came together as a team effort," I nodded neutrally. If someone thanked me for my support, I said, "Of course." Support wasn't inaccurate. It was incomplete. And incompleteness, I had learned, has a way of revealing itself when numbers are final. I scheduled nothing. I escalated nothing. I waited. Behind the scenes, finance prepared projections. Leadership anticipated the close. The deal took on a life of its own, one that assumed compliance, continuity, and my continued quiet presence. No one noticed that I had stopped smoothing last-minute frictions. No one clocked that I wasn't volunteering reassurance. They assumed things were under control because they always had been. That assumption worked in my favor. When the deal officially closed, there was a brief celebration, a congratulatory message in a shared channel, emojis, applause, a vague acknowledgement of everyone who made this happen. I didn't react publicly. Later that day, the compensation notice arrived. It was exactly what I expected. I had closed the biggest deal of the quarter. My commission had been reclassified as a team bonus. The payout dropped from $96,000 to $8,400 overnight. Seeing the numbers in writing didn't sting the way I thought it might. There was no shock, no disbelief, just confirmation. I waited. Not hours, days. That part mattered. Because urgency can look emotional, the delay looks deliberate. When I finally reached out, it wasn't to argue. It wasn't to accuse. It was a request for clarification. Brief, neutral, written. I asked how multi-party contribution had been defined in this case, given the origination timeline. I asked where discretion had been applied and on what basis. I attached nothing. I referenced nothing. I let the question do the work. The response took longer than usual. When it came, it was careful, polite, noncommittal. It thanked me for raising the question and suggested a conversation. I agreed. I didn't prepare talking points. I didn't practice phrasing. I reviewed my facts once more and closed my notebook. Because at this stage, the work was already done. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving blindly. It means moving without spectacle. And by the time anyone realized I was no longer absorbing the impact quietly, the structure had already shifted. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They began with hesitation. The meeting that had been suggested took longer to schedule than usual. Not canceled, just delayed. A calendar shuffle. A request to find time next week. Small signals, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. I was. When we finally met, the tone was different. Still polite, still professional, but less assured. The conversation opened with appreciation, my work ethic, my consistency, my significant contributions. The language hovered carefully around the edges of responsibility without naming it. I listened. They explained the reclassification as standard practice, collaborative effort, shared success. They emphasized culture, fairness, balance. I didn't interrupt. When they finished, I asked a single question: how origination had been defined for the purposes of this deal. There was a pause, not long, just long enough. They referenced team input, cross-functional support, momentum built over time, all reasonable phrases, all nonspecific. So I asked another question: whether the initial outreach, discovery calls, and client alignment I had led were considered origination or merely support. This time, the pause was longer. I could see the recalculation happening, not panic, but reassessment. They were trying to understand where this conversation was going, whether it was emotional, whether it was procedural, whether it could be smoothed over. They asked if I felt undervalued. I said no. That answer unsettled them more than anger would have. I explained calmly that I was seeking alignment between documented process and applied policy. I wanted to understand how discretion had been exercised given the available record. I still didn't present evidence. I didn't need to, because the moment someone realizes you could, the balance changes. The meeting ended without resolution. They thanked me again, promised to look into it, said they appreciated my professionalism. In the days that followed, things shifted subtly. Emails became more precise. Language tightened. People who had previously summarized my work vaguely began copying me explicitly, not generously, cautiously. I noticed finance looping in legal on unrelated matters. I noticed leadership asking more questions before sending recaps. I noticed a new attentiveness to how ownership was described. No one said my name aloud in connection to any of it, but I could feel the system adjusting. The biggest change wasn't how they treated me, it was how they treated the process. Where discretion had once flowed freely, it now moved more slowly. Where assumptions had been made, confirmations were requested. Where summaries had been casual, drafts were reviewed more carefully before being shared. I hadn't accused anyone of wrongdoing. I hadn't demanded restitution. All I had done was refuse ambiguity. That refusal created friction, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to make people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't dismiss. A week later, I received a follow-up. Another meeting, shorter this time, more focused. They acknowledged that my role in the deal had been more central than initially framed. They explained that the reclassification had been made quickly, under pressure, without full review. They didn't apologize. They didn't need to, because by then the consequences were already unfolding elsewhere. I had become visible, not celebrated, not elevated, but seen as someone who noticed details others preferred to keep fluid. Someone who asked questions that required answers. That kind of presence changes how people behave around you. I left the meeting without a final outcome, but with something more important: leverage that had moved from theoretical to real. The system had felt the cost of assuming my silence, and it had begun, quietly, reluctantly, to respond. By the time they tried to fix it, the problem was no longer the payout. That was the part they didn't understand at first. The follow-up conversations became more frequent, not urgent, careful, each one framed as alignment, clarification, and mutual understanding. They wanted to correct the situation without admitting that anything had been wrong. I let them talk. They explained timelines. They referenced workload distribution. They emphasized that no slight had been intended, that the reclassification wasn't personal. I believed them. Intent, however, was no longer relevant. What mattered was precedent. They floated possibilities: a discretionary adjustment in a future quarter, a one-time exception framed as appreciation, a revised role on an upcoming project with more visibility. Each offer was reasonable on the surface. Each one avoided addressing the central issue. Authorship had been reassigned without consent. I didn't reject their proposals. I didn't accept them either. I asked how any of those options would prevent the same thing from happening again. That question changed the temperature because it forced them to confront what they were actually trying to preserve. Not fairness, but flexibility. The ability to reinterpret contributions after outcomes were known. Fixing the payout would have been easy. Fixing the structure was not. They asked what I wanted. I told them the truth. I wanted clarity around origination definitions going forward. I wanted written standards applied consistently. I wanted recognition tied to documented responsibility, not narrative convenience. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for accuracy. There was a pause. Then a careful explanation about how rigid definitions could limit collaboration, how flexibility allowed teams to thrive, how leadership needed discretion to manage complex dynamics. I listened. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say but felt precise. Flexibility shouldn't only move in one direction. Silence followed. Not disagreement, recognition. They knew I was right. They also knew that agreeing fully would require changing habits that benefited them. That was the moment it became too late to fix it quietly, because now the issue wasn't a single commission. It was a system that relied on unspoken labor and unchallenged assumptions. A system I had been part of until I wasn't. I could see the shift in how they looked at me, not with hostility, with calculation. I was no longer the steady background presence. I was a variable. They asked for time. I gave it. During that time, nothing moved backward. The payout remained as it was. The deal stayed closed. The quarter rolled on. But something else changed. I stopped being offered vague assurances. I stopped being asked to be patient. The tone became more formal, more documented. Conversations were summarized carefully. Decisions were clarified in writing. They were protecting themselves now. And in doing so, they were confirming everything I had already understood. When they eventually came back with a revised offer, partial adjustment, structured carefully, it was framed as a goodwill gesture, a way to acknowledge my contribution without reopening the policy. I declined, not because it wasn't enough money, but accepting it would have closed the conversation without changing the conditions that created it. By then, the cost of staying had become clear. And fixing the past wouldn't fix the future. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost quiet enough to miss. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where anyone lost composure. It took place in a glass-walled conference room on a gray afternoon, the kind where the light feels neutral and time moves slowly. 3 of us sat at the table. I had been invited to close the loop. That phrase alone told me everything. They began by acknowledging the situation again. How it had unfolded, how it had escalated, how it had become more complex than anticipated. They spoke carefully, as if language itself were fragile. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't recount the timeline. I didn't restate the numbers. I didn't re-argue the policy. I said something much simpler. I want to be clear about how I work going forward. That shifted the room. I explained, calmly, without accusation, that I wouldn't continue in a role where origination could be reassigned after outcomes were known, that I wouldn't absorb responsibility without corresponding authority. I valued collaboration, but not ambiguity, which only resolved itself when it benefited others. No emotion, no blame, just boundaries. They asked if I was saying I didn't feel respected. I said respect wasn't the issue. Alignment was. I told them that I had operated in good faith for a long time, assuming fairness would be applied consistently. That this experience had shown me where that assumption failed, and that I wasn't interested in litigating the past, only in deciding whether the future made sense. One of them asked, carefully, whether this meant I was considering leaving. I didn't answer immediately. Silence is powerful when it isn't defensive. Then I said yes, not as a threat, not as leverage, as information. That was the moment the conversation truly changed. They didn't try to talk me out of it. They didn't counter with promises or urgency. They asked questions instead, practical ones. Timelines, transitions, what knowledge is needed to be transferred? I answered honestly. I told them I would ensure continuity, that I would document everything necessary, that I would leave things clean. That surprised them, because they had expected heat, emotion, fallout. What they got was clarity. The meeting ended with handshakes. Polite, professional, almost respectful. As I left the room, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not relieved exactly, but unburdened. Confrontation doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes it's just the moment when you stop negotiating with a version of reality that no longer fits. I didn't leave in anger. That's the part people often expect to hear. The dramatic turning point, the emotional release. But what I felt most strongly in the weeks after was calm. A steady, unfamiliar calm that came from no longer negotiating my worth internally. Who I am now is quieter than before, but more defined. I still work in complex environments. I still sit in rooms where power moves indirectly. But I no longer confuse adaptability with erasure. I no longer offer clarity for free or assume that being indispensable will protect me from being diminished. I understand now that systems don't reward effort. They reward leverage, visibility, and narrative control. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them human. And pretending otherwise only delays the moment when you have to decide how you want to participate. I'm more selective with my energy. When I contribute, it's with intention and authorship. When I collaborate, expectations are explicit. I don't rush to fill the silence anymore. I let questions sit unanswered until ownership is clear. This hasn't made me colder. It's made me more honest. I've learned that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage, but only if you're aware of it. Only if you're watching. Only if you're willing to stop performing the role that keeps you small. I don't regret the years I spent being steady. They taught me how organizations actually function beneath the language of fairness. They showed me where the soft pressure points are, where assumptions calcify into policy. And they taught me something else. That integrity isn't about enduring quietly. It's about choosing alignment when endurance becomes distortion. I don't speak louder now. I speak less and mean more. People listen differently, not because I demand it, but because I no longer need their approval to say what's true. The version of me that believed recognition would arrive on its own has faded. In her place is someone who understands timing, structure, and the power of documentation. Someone who knows that silence can be a choice, and that breaking it once, clearly, can change everything. I didn't win in the way stories usually frame winning, but I reclaimed authorship over my work, my boundaries, and my future. And that has changed how I move through the world in ways no bonus ever could. There's a version of this story that could end with numbers, with restitution, with a clean reversal that makes everything feel balanced again. This isn't that story. What stayed with me wasn't the loss of the $96,000, though I won't pretend it didn't matter. What stayed with me was the clarity of seeing how easily value can be reassigned when silence is convenient, and how long we can participate in that silence while telling ourselves it's professionalism. The moral isn't that systems are unfair. That's too simple. The moral is that systems respond to what we tolerate, not what we deserve. For a long time, I tolerated ambiguity because it kept things smooth. I tolerated being described as support because it felt safer than insisting on authorship. I tolerated being overlooked because I believed my work would eventually speak loudly enough on its own. It didn't. Not because it wasn't strong, but because no one had an incentive to amplify it. What changed my trajectory wasn't confrontation. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't even courage in the dramatic sense. It was precision. I stopped asking to be seen and started requiring clarity. I stopped absorbing the cost of misalignment and let it surface where it belonged. I learned that quiet dominance doesn't come from withholding effort. It comes from understanding when effort becomes leverage and when it becomes permission. There's a difference between being collaborative and being editable, between being patient and being pliable, between being calm and being silent. Once you see those differences, you can't unsee them. And once you stop participating in your own diminishment, the system has to respond, even if that response is discomfort, recalibration, or separation. I don't tell this story to encourage bitterness. I tell it to encourage awareness. Because many of us are not being mistreated loudly. We're being diminished quietly. And that makes it harder to name, harder to resist, harder to leave. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Fairness is not self-executing. Authorship is not implied. And silence, when unexamined, teaches people how to treat you. You don't need to burn bridges. You don't need to shout. You don't need revenge. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to let your work be rewritten after the outcome is known. I'll leave you with a question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Where in your own life have you been steady, dependable, and quiet? And what has that silence been teaching others about your value? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.